The encounter. The restaurant was one of those places that looked as though it had been designed not just for eating, but for making people feel small if they didn't belong there. The floors gleamed with marble polished so thoroughly that you could see your reflection while you walked, and every table carried a white tablecloth pressed into perfect lines, as if the staff ironed them right before every seating. Waiters moved like dancers, weaving between tables with trays that looked too heavy for one hand yet balanced as if it were second nature. Background music played softly, jazz with a touch of something classical, that never quite caught attention but gave the air a sense of refinement, like the sound itself was whispering that you were somewhere exclusive. In Scottsdale, Arizona, this place was considered the pinnacle of fine dining. Politicians, athletes, wealthy visitors from across the world came to close deals, celebrate milestones, or just be seen in the kind of setting where the bill alone confirmed you were successful. Among the staff, Danielle Rhodes stood out even though she never intended to. She was a woman who carried herself with quiet self-assurance, the kind that made people look twice but not in a way that disturbed the room. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her uniform always crisp, and her voice carried that balance between politeness and control that every successful waitress eventually learned. Danielle was not just efficient at her job, she made people feel noticed. Regulars remembered her smile, the way she could recall an order without looking at her notepad, the gentle questions she asked that weren't forced but genuine. Some of the older couples who visited weekly would tell her about their grandchildren, and she remembered the names. Businessmen would share that they were flying out soon, and she would ask about their return trip the next time she saw them. It was subtle, almost invisible work, but it was the difference between a server and someone whose presence elevated the entire dining experience. Danielle had learned early on that while people came for the food, they often returned for the way they were treated. That Thursday afternoon, however, brought in a man who had no intention of being treated, not by anyone. Fared Al-Mansouri arrived wearing a suit that looked as though it had been stitched by the most exclusive tailor in Dubai. The fabric shimmered faintly under the restaurant's lights, not garishly, but with the kind of subtle glow that screamed money to those who could tell the difference. His watch was heavy and golden, the kind of piece that wasn't just a timekeeper but a declaration of power. He didn't walk into the restaurant so much as he owned the space by existing in it, each step deliberate, his eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on the corner table by the window as though it had been waiting for him all along. Following him was a younger associate, a man who appeared both eager and slightly nervous, carrying a briefcase that he held almost like a shield. Danielle noticed him the way staff always noticed new guests, the posture, the attitude, the subtle cues of how this interaction might unfold. Her experience told her everything she needed in just seconds. Some guests wanted warmth, others wanted space, some wanted to be pampered, and a rare few wanted to make others feel smaller. Fared fell into the last category even before he spoke. His gaze lingered on the table setting as if testing whether it was worthy of him, and his silence pressed into the room like weight. Danielle smoothed her apron, drew a steadying breath, and approached with the practiced professionalism she carried like armor. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome. Can I start you off with a drink?" she asked, pen in hand, tone measured, respectful but not submissive. Fared did not immediately acknowledge her. His phone screen held his attention, thumb sliding with deliberate disinterest. The pause stretched long enough that most servers might have cleared their throat or repeated the question. Danielle did neither. She stood with patience, her expression calm, her posture upright. Finally, he glanced up, offered her a swift appraisal that felt more like inventory than acknowledgement, and muttered, "Water with lemon. Nothing else." His voice carried no warmth, no recognition that she was a person. It was a command, flat and dismissive. Danielle nodded, her face revealing nothing. "Of course, I'll bring that right out." She turned smoothly as though she had not just been brushed aside. That was part of the job, keeping dignity intact even when someone tried to strip it away. But as she walked toward the bar to collect the water, she caught a flicker of something from the corner of her eye. The billionaire leaned toward his associate, and in Arabic muttered a few words. Even without fluency, most people could have guessed the tone. It was sharp, biting, laced with disdain. The younger associate gave a small laugh, hesitant but eager to match his employer's mood. To anyone else in the restaurant, it was background noise, a foreign language carried off by the hum of conversation. But Danielle was not anyone else. She had grown up immersed in languages, and though her story was unknown to this man, she recognized the rhythm, the phrasing, the insult embedded within those words. The glass of water clinked lightly as she placed it on a tray. She could have ignored it, could have treated it like so many other small cruelties that waitstaff endure daily, the comments, the tone, the assumptions. She had, after all, built a career on letting things roll off her shoulders. But something about the arrogance in his smirk, the way he assumed invisibility in his words, struck differently. Danielle felt the heat of injustice rising quietly inside her. She steadied her breath again, masking every flicker of reaction with the same composure she carried for years. She returned to the table, placing the water gently before him. He did not thank her, did not even glance in her direction, too busy scanning his phone screen once more. As she set the glass down, another muttered remark in Arabic slid from his lips, this one sharper, followed by the associate's forced chuckle. Ferd leaned back, satisfied, believing the world around him bent easily to his will. He had no idea the storm he was summoning with his arrogance. Danielle adjusted her notepad, straightened slightly, and then in perfect fluent Arabic said, "Would you prefer still water or sparkling, sir? I want to make sure I understand your taste correctly." The words cut through the space with the precision of a blade. For a moment, silence fell around their table. Ferd froze, the glass halfway lifted in his hand. His associate's eyes widened, the forced smile dropping instantly. Danielle's voice had not been loud, but it carried clarity, confidence, and above all, fluency that could not be mistaken for coincidence. Every syllable was shaped perfectly, her accent careful, not stiff but lived. Ferd's eyes rose slowly, meeting hers for the first time with something more than dismissal. Shock, disbelief, and a flicker of something almost like embarrassment colored his expression. He had assumed invisibility, assumed that his words floated in a private world only he and his associate shared. Now that illusion shattered. Danielle's face carried the same professional calm, the same polite smile. But in her eyes there was a quiet strength, a dignity that told him clearly. She had heard every word. And unlike what he had assumed, she was not the invisible woman at his table. She was someone who could stand equal in any room he entered. The associate coughed lightly, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The air in the restaurant had changed, subtle but undeniable. Conversations at nearby tables softened, curious glances darted toward the corner. People might not have known the words exchanged, but they could sense the electricity. They could feel the moment the balance shifted. Ferd set his glass down with deliberate slowness, his eyes locked on Danielle. For perhaps the first time that day, he was not entirely in control, and Danielle, without raising her voice, without abandoning her professionalism, had changed the energy of the entire room with one simple choice: to respond, to be seen, and to remind him that arrogance often blinds men to the truth standing directly in front of them. And that was only the beginning. The past. Behind the waitress, Danielle Rhodes did not arrive at that restaurant by accident, nor did she wake up one morning and decide that waiting tables would be her path in life. To understand the strength she carried in her eyes, the calm way she spoke even when facing down arrogance, one had to step back years into her past, into the life of a young woman who had been forced to grow stronger than her circumstances ever allowed. She had grown up in a neighborhood where the sound of ambition was often drowned out by the grind of survival. Her mother worked long hours as a nurse's aide. Her father disappeared before she was old enough to remember him, and Danielle learned early what it meant to shoulder responsibility that wasn't meant for children. She helped her younger siblings with homework, cooked dinner when her mother was too exhausted to stand, and discovered that the world rarely gave second chances to people who looked like her. Yet, even in those early years, Danielle had a spark that separated her from the weight of her environment. She loved words. Not just English words, but words in every language she could get her hands on. When other kids were playing games in the street, she was in the library listening to language tapes, memorizing phrases in Spanish, French, and eventually Arabic. It wasn't school that taught her first. It was hunger, a hunger for connection and for understanding people beyond the block she grew up on. High school teachers noticed her gift quickly. She could mimic accents with uncanny accuracy, translate simple passages after hearing them only once, and she seemed to possess an almost musical ear for rhythm and tone. With encouragement, Danielle applied for scholarships and managed to secure one for linguistics at a well-regarded university. For a while, it seemed as if life had finally decided to open its doors to her. She walked into lecture halls filled with hope, studied under professors who spoke 7 or 8 languages themselves, and dreamed of one day working for an international organization where her skills would bridge gaps between cultures. Those were some of the happiest days of her youth. Long nights in study halls with dictionaries stacked around her, cups of coffee growing cold as she pushed through assignments. Laughter shared with classmates who, for the first time in her life, saw her not just as the girl from a tough neighborhood, but as a peer with brilliance in her eyes. But life has a way of reminding dreamers that hope is fragile. Halfway through her degree, her mother's health collapsed. Years of overwork and neglected medical care took their toll, and suddenly Danielle found herself standing in hospital corridors, balancing textbooks under one arm and medical bills in the other. She tried at first to juggle everything, to keep studying, to work part-time, to take care of her siblings. But the cracks widened. When the bills kept arriving and the financial aid office explained with rehearsed sympathy that her scholarship could not cover the mounting costs, Danielle made the choice no student should ever be forced to make. She withdrew from her program and picked up double shifts at restaurants and cafes. Her professors begged her to stay, promised they would write recommendations that she could take a leave and return later. But when you are 19 and your family cannot eat, theoretical futures mean little compared to the electricity bill waiting on the kitchen counter. It was during those years of struggle that Danielle's resilience hardened into something unshakable. She worked at diners where customers treated her like furniture, at coffee shops where businessmen barked orders without eye contact, and at bars where she had to smile even when every fiber of her being wanted to tell someone off. Yet she never abandoned her love for languages. She kept her textbooks, listened to recordings on the bus, practiced with anyone who would humor her. On quiet nights after her siblings were asleep, she would whisper phrases in Arabic, Italian, Mandarin, her voice low, her notebook filled with scribbles of translations. It wasn't a career anymore, not yet, but it was part of who she was. Arabic had been her greatest challenge and her greatest triumph. She picked it up initially out of curiosity, fascinated by the script, the way the letters curved like art, the rhythm of the sounds that seemed to dance. At first it was overwhelming, but Danielle never gave up. A neighbor, an older Egyptian woman who lived 3 houses down, noticed her efforts and offered to practice with her. For months, Danielle would sit in that woman's living room, sipping tea, repeating sentences until her tongue could shape them naturally. Later, when she could afford a short study-abroad exchange, she traveled to Morocco, working odd jobs in exchange for immersion. That trip changed her. It wasn't just about language anymore, but about dignity, connection, and the realization that speaking someone else's words meant entering their world with respect. By the time she returned home, Danielle was fluent in a way that few expected from someone who had never finished her degree. Yet despite her talent, doors did not swing open. Applications went unanswered, interviews ended with polite rejection, and she discovered that society often measured worth by the pedigree of a diploma rather than the reality of skill. So she continued working in restaurants, sharpening her professionalism like a weapon, refusing to let anyone see the frustration burning beneath her calm surface. That was the woman who stood before Farid al-Mansouri on that Thursday afternoon. To him, she looked like a waitress, just another pair of hands delivering water and food. But inside her lived years of sacrifice, knowledge earned not in ivory towers but in nights filled with exhaustion and determination. Every insult she had endured in silence had prepared her for this moment. Every page of Arabic she had memorized on buses, every whispered phrase at midnight had built the foundation that allowed her to look into the eyes of a billionaire and answer him in his own language without trembling. The arrogance of men like Farid did not shock her anymore. She had encountered variations of it countless times. But what struck her was how easily he assumed invisibility. To insult someone in a language you thought they could not understand was not just arrogance, it was cowardice. The belief that one's cruelty would never be met with consequence. Danielle had grown up in a world where people underestimated her constantly. She had learned long ago that the sweetest victories came not from shouting or breaking composure, but from revealing, at the right moment, that you were never what they thought you were. So when she spoke to him in Arabic, she did not do it to humiliate. She did it to remind herself and everyone around her that dignity cannot be erased by wealth, and that knowledge, hard-won knowledge, can silence even the loudest arrogance. The restaurant had felt it. The associate had felt it. And for the first time in a long time, Danielle herself felt the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she was supposed to be, not because it was her final destination, but because it was the stage for the moment her story would begin to change. And somewhere deep down, though she would not admit it yet, she also knew that this was not the last exchange between her and Farid al-Mansouri. Something in his eyes when he realized she understood him promised more. Whether it was conflict, curiosity, or some strange twist of fate, the billionaire and the waitress had stepped into each other's lives in a way that neither could easily undo. The shift in power, the silence that followed Danielle's calm reply in Arabic did not last long. Silence in a crowded restaurant never does. It hovers like smoke, making people look around, searching for the source, waiting for something to happen next. And something did happen. Farid al-Mansouri, who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms with nothing more than his presence, suddenly found himself the subject of an unspoken question that every pair of eyes in the restaurant now seemed to carry. What would he do? For the first time, he had been challenged in a way he had not anticipated, and the challenge had come not from a rival billionaire or a boardroom full of executives, but from a woman in a server's uniform, standing with her notepad at the ready, her expression poised, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had every right to stand in his world. For a man like Farid, silence itself was dangerous. He had built an empire on the foundation of being in control, on always having the last word, on dictating the terms of every conversation. Now, in a small corner of a restaurant thousands of miles from his homeland, his control had slipped. His associate, the young man who moments earlier had laughed obediently at his insults, now sat stiffly, his hands clenched on his lap, his eyes darting between Farid and Danielle with something close to unease. Even he understood that a line had been crossed, and worse, that the waitress had stepped over it with dignity rather than defiance, leaving his employer no easy ground to stand on. Farid recovered quickly, or at least he tried to. He leaned back in his chair, lifted the glass of water slowly, and took a measured sip as though nothing unusual had happened. His eyes, however, told a different story. They studied Danielle with sharpness, no longer scanning her like an inconvenience, but examining her as if she had become a puzzle he did not understand. When he finally set the glass down, he spoke in English again, his accent clipped but his voice carrying that practiced arrogance. "So," he said, his words deliberate, "you speak Arabic, interesting, not common for someone in your line of work." It was meant to diminish, to pull her back into the role he had assigned her in his mind, the role of the server who existed only to deliver plates and refill glasses. Danielle did not flinch. She had endured worse disguised as politeness, and she had no intention of surrendering the ground she had gained. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that concealed steel behind warmth, and replied evenly, "Languages have always been a passion of mine. I enjoy being able to connect with people from different cultures." Her tone was measured, respectful, but beneath it ran a current that reminded him she had not forgotten what he had said. The associate cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to diffuse the tension with a weak chuckle. "Yes, very impressive," he said quickly, glancing at Danielle with something that almost looked like admiration. But his words only seemed to irritate Farid further, as though the acknowledgement of her ability somehow magnified his own misstep. It would have been easy for Danielle to retreat at that point, to step back into the safety of invisibility, to let the moment dissolve, but something inside her had shifted. For years she had carried her skills quietly, waiting for a day when they would matter, and now, here was a moment where they mattered profoundly. Not because it would change her paycheck, not because it would earn her promotion, but because it reminded her that dignity is not something anyone can strip away without your permission. She leaned slightly forward, her notepad still in her hand, her voice calm as ever. "Would you like to hear today's specials, sir?" The question was ordinary, but the way she spoke it in Arabic again was not. Each word was crisp, perfectly enunciated, delivered not as a performance but as a quiet assertion of competence. The billionaire's lips pressed into a line, and for the first time in years he found himself without a clever retort. The restaurant had shifted subtly, too. Patrons nearby, sensing the undercurrent of tension, had grown quieter, their ears tuned to the exchange. They did not understand the language, but they understood power and they saw it shifting, slipping away from the man in the tailored suit into the hands of the woman with the notepad. And this was the part that Farid hated most. Not that she spoke Arabic, not that she had revealed his insult, but that she had done it without raising her voice, without losing her composure. Arrogance thrives on reaction. It feeds on outrage, on visible wounds, on someone else's stumble. Danielle gave him none of that. She gave him grace, and grace in the face of arrogance is more dangerous than anger. The associate finally broke the moment with a nervous laugh, fumbling for his menu. "Maybe we should just order," he muttered, trying to draw the attention back to something ordinary. Danielle shifted smoothly, taking their orders with the same professionalism she had shown to every other table. But Farid's eyes never left her. His curiosity was piqued, his pride wounded, and his mind already working to reassert himself. He was not a man accustomed to being surprised, and he did not like how it felt. When Danielle walked back to the kitchen, her step steady, her shoulders squared, she could feel the weight of the moment still clinging to her. She knew he would not let it end there. Men like Farid rarely did. They tested, they pressed, they tried to prove to themselves that they were still in control. But Danielle also knew something else. Control was not something you gave to people like him unless you chose to. And today she was not in the mood to surrender. Back at the table, Farid leaned toward his associate, but this time his words were quieter, more thoughtful. "Find out about her," he muttered. "She is unexpected." The younger man hesitated, then nodded quickly, scribbling something discreetly on his phone. It was not admiration that drove the order. It was curiosity, perhaps even suspicion. Farid wanted to know why a waitress in Arizona could speak Arabic with such fluency, and more than that, why she had dared to use it with him. Meanwhile, Danielle collected plates, delivered drinks, and moved between tables with her usual rhythm. But inside, she felt the tremor of something new. She had shifted the balance of a moment, and the ripple of that shift would not end with a glass of water or a casual insult. Something larger was unfolding, something that would carry her far beyond this dining room. She could not see the path yet, but she felt its presence like the first tremor before a storm. And Farid, though he did not admit it even to himself, felt it too. The price of peace and the gathering storm. The galaxy had grown quieter after Earth's brutal display of power, yet that silence was deceptive, like the still air before a hurricane. The council, humiliated beyond measure, had retreated into its chambers, desperately trying to weave together a narrative that would justify their arrogance and save them from complete collapse. Empires whispered behind closed doors, rulers debated in sleepless nights, and warlords sharpened their ambitions in the shadows. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the galaxy was teetering on the edge of something much larger than war, something closer to reckoning. Earth had not just defended itself, it had reshaped the very foundation of galactic order. The fleets of other empires might have still been vast, but they now felt heavy and outdated. Their weapons nothing compared to the sudden, merciless precision humanity had revealed. Even more disturbing was the mystery surrounding Earth's technology. Where had they been hiding? How had they advanced so far without being noticed? And the most haunting question of all, was what the galaxy had witnessed only a fraction of their true power? In the weeks that followed, reports began to trickle in from the outer sectors. Alien scouts, eager to prove their worth to the Council, had shadowed human vessels, hoping to catch a glimpse of their secrets. None returned. Some ships were found drifting days later, their systems fried, their crews alive but broken, whispering nonsense about shadows moving between stars, machines that seemed alive, and weapons that erased entire sensor arrays with a single pulse. These tales spread like wildfire across trading hubs and military academies, painting Earth not just as a dangerous adversary but as a kind of spectral force, something beyond the conventional rules of war. To common people across the galaxy, humanity became a paradox, a beacon of hope for those oppressed by Council corruption, and a nightmare for those who feared their vengeance. In the streets of distant colonies, murals of human warriors appeared overnight, painted by alien hands who saw in Earth's defiance the possibility of freedom. In darker corners, however, secret meetings were held, where leaders of dying empires discussed how to unite before humanity grew too strong to be challenged at all. Back on Earth, The debate was no less fierce. Within the grand chambers of the United Human Assembly, leaders argued for hours on end about the cost of peace. Some demanded restraint, fearing that further displays of power would provoke the council into forging a massive alliance against them. Others, hardened by centuries of being underestimated, argued for striking first, to dismantle the council before it had the chance to rise again. And in the middle of it all were the voices of ordinary humans, carried across the networks: farmers, miners, engineers, and scientists, each demanding that humanity never again bow its head to a council of strangers. There was a sense of unity Earth had not known in centuries, a binding thread of pride and determination, but beneath it ran a current of unease. Power was intoxicating, and every empire in history had fallen to the weight of its own ambition. Could humanity truly be different? Or was it only a matter of time before they too became the very tyrants they despised? The council, sensing its control slipping away, devised a desperate plan. If they could not outfight Earth in open battle, they would undermine them in secrecy. Agents were dispatched into the shadows of human space, mercenaries hired to sabotage trade routes, spies inserted into colonies to stir unrest. Yet what the council did not expect was how tightly humanity had bound itself together after centuries of division. Every attempt at sabotage was met not only with swift retaliation, but with something far more dangerous: adaptation. Humans studied every move, learned from every attack, and turned each failure of the council into a lesson that made them stronger. In time, it became clear that Earth did not simply fight wars. They absorbed them, reshaping themselves around each challenge until what had once been a weakness became their greatest strength. The council's hidden war had backfired, and in the shadows of that failure, more empires began to abandon their allegiance, quietly reaching out to Earth not as foes but as potential allies. Yet among all these political games and whispered betrayals, one truth stood out, heavy and undeniable. The galaxy was no longer what it had been. The old order was crumbling, and Earth had become the fault line upon which everything would break. Across the stars, children grew up hearing stories of the humans who had stood against the council, their names carried like legends, their ships painted like symbols of rebellion. Even those who feared Earth could not help but admire the audacity of a species that had refused to kneel. But admiration could not erase fear, and fear, when cornered, often gave birth to desperation. The council's arrogance had lit the spark, but the storm gathering now was far larger than even Earth might have intended. The price of peace had been paid in humiliation, and the galaxy was learning that peace built on fear could never last. The fracture of the galaxy, the illusion of balance in the galaxy, did not last long. Though the council tried to conceal its fractures behind grand speeches and carefully staged broadcasts, the truth was leaking out in every direction. Empires that had once obeyed council decrees with unwavering loyalty were now hesitant to act without questioning whether Earth's shadow lingered nearby. Merchants refused to pay tribute unless the council could guarantee their protection, and entire sectors began whispering of independence. Even within the council's fortified chambers, voices once united in arrogance now turned on each other. Some demanded the extermination of humanity before it was too late, while others, seeing the strength Earth had displayed, argued that cooperation might be the only way forward. The chamber that had once been a temple of unity now resounded with the sound of bitter arguments, slammed fists, and broken trust. And while the council fought itself, Earth's influence only grew stronger. The United Human Assembly, which had once been filled with hesitation and cautious words, now found itself in a position of unprecedented strength. Messages arrived daily from alien leaders who wanted to negotiate, not with the council, but directly with Earth. Colonies suffering under centuries of corruption begged for protection, sending delegations with desperate promises of resources and loyalty in exchange for safety. For the first time in recorded history, humanity was not the species asking for recognition. They were the species being courted, the silent power whose approval could shift the fate of entire worlds. And yet, beneath the glow of pride, a dangerous debate simmered among humanity's own leaders. Should they accept these offers and begin weaving their own empire, standing not as equals but as rulers? Or should they remain what they had always been, fighters for their own survival, unwilling to wear the chains of empire even when offered willingly by others? The weight of that question hung heavy over every meeting, every council hall, every late-night discussion between Earth statesmen and admirals. But even as humanity wrestled with the responsibility of its new position, the Council made a final gamble, an act so reckless it would forever alter the course of history. In their desperation, they approved the creation of a secret fleet, built not by their member states but in hidden shipyards on uncharted worlds. The resources required nearly bled the treasury dry, but the Council believed that one decisive strike could shatter Earth's rising influence before it was too late. The fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, composed of experimental warships fused with stolen technologies, powered by engines whose blueprints had been ripped from ancient archives, long considered too dangerous to touch. These ships were not built for patrols or displays of force. They were forged for one purpose only: obliteration. And in the cold void of space, far from the eyes of curious scouts, this armada gathered in silence, waiting for the order to move. When word of the Council's secret construction leaked, as all secrets eventually did, it spread like wildfire across the stars. At first it was little more than a whisper, a rumor dismissed by those who believed the Council too fractured to build something so daring. But then came the grainy transmissions smuggled from fleeing workers, the massive shipyards, the colossal frames of warships under construction, the endless rows of weapon systems that made even the most hardened veterans feel a cold shiver run down their spines. Panic erupted across the galaxy. Empires already leaning toward Earth's protection now had a choice to make: wait and hope that the Council's armada would never march, or side openly with Earth before the inevitable clash came. And one by one, worlds began to choose. Some pledged allegiance to Earth in open defiance, while others prepared to fight alongside the Council, unwilling to surrender their centuries of power without a struggle. The galaxy, once united under one ruling body, was splintering into factions, each preparing for a war that everyone now understood could not be avoided. Meanwhile, Earth remained silent. No declarations, no threats, no sweeping campaigns of propaganda. Their fleets did not parade across the stars, nor did they flaunt their weapons as the Council had done for centuries. Instead, humanity watched. They observed the Council's panic, studied the designs of the experimental ships, and waited with the patience of a species that had spent generations enduring obscurity. This silence unnerved the galaxy even more than open threats would have, for silence meant calculation, and calculation meant certainty. If Earth was not speaking, it was because they already knew what they would do when the Council finally struck. And that thought chilled both allies and enemies alike. In the shadows of collapsing trust and mounting fear, one thing became unmistakably clear: the Council had already lost its grip. The fracture of the galaxy was no longer a possibility. It was reality, and Earth stood at the center of it. Where once they had been overlooked and dismissed, they were now the fault line upon which the future would either be built or destroyed. Across distant worlds, people began preparing for the inevitable. Some stockpiled weapons, others carved out shelters deep beneath their cities, and many prayed to gods both human and alien alike. The storm was coming, and everyone could feel it. The only uncertainty was not whether it would strike, but whether Earth would be the destroyer or the savior when the skies finally burned.